Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining our VST webinar, the webcast where we look at how the growing focus on HSE, ESG, whichever acronym we decide to use, affects businesses, but also the role that technology can play. I'm your host, Chris Parry, and today we'll be looking and digging a little deeper into business supply chains to understand the health, safety, social, and governance topics that affect them. Now, as I push the pandemic to the farthest corner of my mind, to which now seems to be a very distant memory, it was probably during this time that we all saw and we experienced how supply chains were really tested. And whilst I guess many of us here in Australia experienced the fighting over limited toilets roll supplies in local supermarkets, we also saw some major disruptions in international supply chains as well. And while I'm thoroughly enjoying my fluffy blue slippers here as I speak with you all today, and I have to admit I purchased those online during the pandemic, I can recall waiting impatiently by my letterbox thinking about what are all the businesses that went in and contributed to, I guess, my impulse buy at the time, and what the domino effect was as a result of the stresses on those supply chains before they actually had to go through and land firmly on my feet. So to help me break this down today, I'm joined here with Esa Immonen from Datamine, so we can further explore the role of HSE and ESG topics on our supply chains, and I guess how businesses can leverage technology to mitigate risk and build resiliency in their supply chains. So thanks for joining us, Esa.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks, Chris. Thanks for inviting me along.
So, Esa, I understand that you've got a fairly extensive background in supply chains. Perhaps you could give us a little bit of a background into your experiences and maybe perhaps some examples of where you've seen HSE or ESG, I guess, impact those supply chains.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, a couple of years ago, I did manage a multinational supply chain for a resources company, and so that role sort of covered the procurement and logistics functions. And it was across Asia Pacific, and also we did reach into Latin America as well. We really looked after a modal type logistics chain, so including shipping and trucking. And one of the key challenges of the role, looking across that region, was really having a look at the transparency that we could have across the entire supply chain, from, I guess, the point of origin all the way up to, I guess, us, and then, I guess, our next customer coming along. So, and with that transparency, it was really looking at how do we sort of identify potential risks along there, so we can understand what we need to try and mitigate. And with that, we're sort of looking at and trying to understand and complying with local regulations. As you can imagine, going across many countries, there's a lot of variances that we have to deal with. And also, when we got into the countries, we really needed to work with the local teams to look at how do we control and manage risks. And this was an issue because many times it's actually challenged their normal mode of operation, and also generally had a perceived cost impact on them as well. So as we sort of worked with the local teams to look at trying to implementing systems, driving accountability and minimal levels of acceptance from a risk perspective, we had to challenge the local perception of risk. So I guess an example, we can imagine that, I guess, in some of the Southeast Asian countries where the team ride their scooters into work, very busy roads, and then they come into work and all of a sudden they have this I guess, controlled environment, whereas out in the normal world, some of the risks aren't quite controlled. So we're having to, I guess, try to work and educate with some of the local team members to lift that minimum level of acceptance for us.
Mm. Well, so you spoke there around increased regulations and, I guess, complexities within the supply chain, and I guess it's probably fair to say that supply chains themselves are becoming more complex due to just these increased regulations, but there's also a number of other variety of performance metrics that's affecting them as well. And just while you were talking there, and I took a sip of my morning coffee in my fluffy blue slippers here, I did note the brand on my coffee saying, fair trade. And, I guess now we can start to imagine the additional complexity on that supply chain from introducing those new, I guess, metrics and performance metrics that is now expanding into, I guess, social and ethical standards. How have you seen that evolve over the last couple of years?
I think initially a good observation, sort of see that trademark there, because that's, I guess, driving or where supply chains are heading. But a good question on how you see that evolve over the years. From my perspective, I've really seen modern supply chains grow on the back of globalization. And, what does that mean? Well, it's more, I guess, they sort of evolved and they really were focusing more about how do businesses actually improve the profitability along the supply chain, and really looking at how do we move to a lower cost producer, all whilst hoping that the quality remains consistent. And so I guess with this drive to reducing cost, quite a complicated system sort of came out of that, which is what I call just in time, or JIT. Now, I'm sure you've heard of it. Most people will hear of it, particularly from a production environment. But what's that mean? Well, it's really looking at how do you reduce excess or redundancy in the supply chain, and which in turn, reduces the work in progress and of stock, but then also optimizes costs. And what that actually drove the businesses to do is just due to the risk of just in time, because if there's any hiccup along the supply chain, you'll have some timing risks of when supply's coming, or even volume risks. So it drove them to look for multiple suppliers. And so that just really caused this explosion of suppliers, or the web to really evolve. So instead of having a simple supply chain, you would have this multi-tier type effect coming out. And so the problem with that is you generally get, or you probably have a certain level of understanding or control over your primary supplier, e.g. the person who's giving your goods directly. But as you move further away from that primary supplier, so you're looking at your supplier, and so forth, the transparency of the supply chain really becomes less clear, and really it's very opaque in most circumstances. And I guess this drive to lower unit costs caused a lot of supply chains to enter areas of the globe, or even countries where standards are probably less than ideal when you're looking from a worker condition or sustainability standard. Now, I'm going to go off on a small tangent here, but I think it adds a little bit of context. Have you heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs?
Yes, I have, yeah.
Yeah, good. Well, for those who haven't, it's a theory that's developed by a psychologist in the 20th century, a guy called Abraham Maslow. And it really just says needs of, when you're lower down in the hierarchy, must be satisfied before individuals can attend to the higher needs. Why am I talking about this here? Well, I've got a concept where I think that our current supply chains almost mimic the Maslow's hierarchy. And what I mean by this is that the Western consumer I'd consider to be in the self-actualization or esteemed tiers of this hierarchy. And so the top of the hierarchy. And generally our primary suppliers are generally in this tier as well. But as our suppliers and our suppliers, so forth, have looked to improve their profitability, they've looked for suppliers or manufacturers that have a lower cost base. Unfortunately, the lower the cost base, or the lower cost base sort of exists for a reason. And as many of these suppliers are probably operating with workers actually trying to satisfy the basic needs. And this is where the real potential exists for exploitation, and be that for workers, the communities, or the environment. And I guess some of these risks are sort of being brought to the consumer's attention now, and hence people are starting to ask for more transparent supply chains. And realistically, the final consumer now is not just focused on purchasing power of the dollar. They're also wanting to understand the impact that their habits or their purchasing is having on the environment or communities. So ultimately, the consumer does have the ultimate control now. But rolling this into businesses, they're actually seeing a competitive advantage where they can actually promote their products if they sort of meet or exceed standards. And I guess one of those standards is fair trade coffee.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting how you draw those lines between Maslow's hierarchy of needs to a supply chain, right? And that actually, I guess, dovetails down to where greater transparency is required low down in your supply chain and understanding those linkages. Because I guess knowing your supplier, and depends the length of that chain, right at the beginning of that supply chain is probably where the greater help is actually needed itself, right? So
Yeah,
it's, I guess, having
absolutely.
that transparency there is essential for businesses.
Yep, I agree. And I guess on the transparency, I'll ask you a question, Chris. So,
Sure.
whilst we're seeing the increased scrutiny of supply chains, and businesses are actually under more pressure to really understand their supply network due to the consumer. They need to be more transparent in their outsourcing and also reporting on their performance. How do you see companies moving towards a more transparent or maybe a more accountable supply chain, particularly in their operating ecosystems?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's not an easy one because I think there's a variety of things that actually need to come together here, and I don't think there's just a silver bullet that's going to solve all of that big problem, right? But if I was to break it down into, I guess, a couple of categories, I think the first would be, I guess, commitment from the business, and this is really coming from a top-down perspective. The business needs to have that concerted effort to say, you know what, we really want to understand the linkages within our supply chains, the dependencies within our supply chains from a HSE ESG perspective, and really understand, those performance metrics within there. Okay, and this isn't just, I guess, a tokenism of saying, yeah, we want to have an understanding of what's in there. It requires people, budget, time, tools, all of those things to do it effectively. Second element to it would be around the scope, and that is, okay, now we've had that commitment of understanding, of wanting to understand rather what's within the supply chain. It's the scope is, well, what is it that we're actually trying to do here, and what is it that we want to prioritize? What's our long-term strategy as a business that we were actually trying to do here, and what are the programs, initiatives, strategies that we're wanting to deploy within the business to maybe to increase supply chain performance, and maybe increase resiliency. So having that scope is really important. Then I'd say the next one would be looking at, I guess, organizational readiness. So that is understanding what we have today in terms of the information and the data that is coming from our supply chains. What is maybe missing, and what are some of the things that we need to capture so we can understand the full picture of what's going on within the supply chain. And then we need to start thinking about how we're going about to capture that information from our suppliers and our suppliers and so on. What's the volume of data that we're going to be wanting to capture? What are the types of data that we're wanting to capture? How are we going to analyze? How are we going to aggregate all of that information? What are some compliance and audits checks that we can put in place to ensure authenticity of the information, to ensure its completeness and its accuracy of that information as well? And then I guess the final part to it would be the all-important engagement, right? So once we've got the foundations and the building blocks of, we've got the top-down approach from commitment, we've defined the scope of what we're trying to do, we've understood our business readiness to execute, now we have to execute. And that's around what's the engagement schedules and plans and cycles. We also need to make sure that it would be beneficial to all parties. It's not just about me. It's about making sure that the process is also beneficial to, the suppliers and their suppliers and so on. How do we make sure it's in line with expectations?
Yeah.
Understanding the data that's coming in and ensuring that it's aligned with everyone's business benefits and needs on that side of things. So I think those would be some good foundations.
Absolutely.
That would be, crucial for setting up the foundations to implement that transparency within your supply chain. And so I guess then that kind of leads me to, a question around, technology and the role that it plays in facilitating those, the transparency that we want within our supply chains. And I guess it's a term that is starting to become a little bit more common now, and we're hearing about, which is chain of custody. Maybe you could expand upon what chain of custody is for us, and maybe share your thoughts of the role that technology can help within determining chain of custody.
Yeah, no worries, Chris. Yeah, chain of custody, interesting terms. I guess if you're not in the looking at supply chains, you could probably imagine it means many different things. But basically, from a supply chain perspective, it means, I guess, a documented and traceable process where we're sort of looking at the product, the material, or even information, and how it actually moves through the supply chain, I guess, from primary production to the end product. And so really looking at, I guess, covering the production, handling, distribution within the supply chain, with one of the main goals being to ensure that there's transparency across the entire chain. There's a certain level of accountability as well. And I think key these days as well is the ability to actually track the origin of the product and how it's handled and moved through the process. So and to do that actually accurately. And so there's a few elements to sort of consider from a chain of custody perspective. And the first one is, as I said before, that what's the source of its origin, and so really where was it manufactured, grown, or extracted. And so some of these come in, some of the critical minerals, and looking at war areas where we've got war. So just looking at where's that source of the origin. Is it using forced labour as well? Then, as mentioned before, there's handling and transportation that we need to look at as well. And so really understanding the entities involved, conditions where the product or how the product was transported, any transfers or handovers between parties as well, sort of tracking that. Just normal general record keeping. And so again, keeping accurate records, and records could be like invoices, shipping documents, quality control reports, any other sort of certification or certificates or any sort of compliance documents along the way. We roll that in with verification and authentication as well. And that's really just being able to track the product and say what it is. So that's where, using like barcodes on products or RFID tags as well. Some people might even say the use of blockchain. And then another one's security measures. So that's really looking at, depending on what the product is, protecting from sort of tampering, theft, or even unauthorized access. So you're looking at what sort of seals or locks or controlled access points you have along the whole supply chain. Just general chain of custody documentation as well. So you're really just pulling all this stuff together where you've got some dates, timestamps, and signatures along the way, so you can sort of have an audited process. I think I mentioned compliance and certificates before. And I guess overall, you're looking at the transparency and accountability. So basically having a process where all the stakeholders can access all the relevant information they need at a point in time. And sort of mentioned some of this stuff previously about some of the risks that you're trying to control or help you understand. So you're looking at, I guess, the conflict minerals, which some people might call the 3TG minerals, but it basically stands for tantalum, tin, and tungsten, and gold. You're really trying to track if there's any issues with human rights, so child labour, forced labour, or even dangerous working conditions. Looking at potential environmental impact, so is it any degradation that's caused by the supply chain, pollution, or even over extraction if you're looking at sort of fishing. And then really rolling into regulatory compliance as well. So some that I've sort of been involved with from an OHS perspective is, managing the truck load weights, what you're loading on them, but then environmentally, just what emissions you're having too. And so, as you can imagine, one of the challenges in establishing a chain of custody is that it involves multiple parties, international borders, and a really, really diverse regulatory environment. And this just throws up communication gaps, data inconsistencies, and, as I mentioned before, differing standards. And so it's a complicated system, many actors involved, and this is all operating in an ever-changing global environment. You just think of impacts of natural disasters or even geopolitical impacts. And so this is where technology, I see, really playing or defining or having a clear role in this, because everything we just went through, you can see it's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of complexity. But once you've got your process set up, you can roll the technology in. I see it as the tool that can capture, collate, and control data from multiple sources. You can use it to model potential scenarios, statistically identify risks, so looking at the likelihood and consequence, potentially recommend controls to mitigate the risk. And one of the key areas I see is just really having a documented process for an audit trail as well. So you know what's happened where and by who as well.
Yeah.
And with that, supply chains or the technology is really enabler in this process, and it'll allow us to get a better outcome. And so where I see technology coming in, it'll really facilitate some automation and really get it improved, or you can use it for an improved decision support tool as well. And so really brings on more and better decisions to be made. So you can do them quicker, so you can actually handle some volume coming through. And all of that sort of rolls into allowing to actually be more proactive and actually have a preventative strategy as opposed to being very reactionary. And so at the end of the day, having a good system that uses technology will really improve your ability to supply a customer with expected quantity and quality that they're after, and meeting appropriate standards, which, rolling it all up from a supplier perspective, means you'll at least be able to maintain your revenue, if not actually improve it. Because if you've got a better system than the next you can probably maintain your supply and keep that revenue coming into your business.
Yeah, I guess with chain of custody, I mean, it's not just being driven from, call it, commercial markets, also consumer markets as well, that is
Absolutely.
also demanding this greater transparency as well, which is a good thing, right? I guess that fair trade is a great example of it. Consumers are wanting to see that greater transparency, but it's also the legislation and legislative requirements. It's just going to increase more and more over time as we're starting to introduce more of these new performance metrics, which we touched on a little bit earlier as well. So,
yeah. Well, I guess that's probably a question to give back to you, Chris. That there has been a massive increase in the number of regulatory and legislative requirements that businesses need to adhere to over the last sort of decade. How do you see technology helping in this regard?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think you touched on it just a little bit before, but maybe I'll just expand upon it from a technology perspective in a little bit more detail, because I think just implementing software isn't going to automatically make you compliant, right? I mean, there's hard work that the business has to put in, right? And we spoke about before the foundations in terms of having your commitment, your scope, your readiness, and then finally the engagement, right? So there's a bunch of work that needs to happen before we get into the technology side of things. But once we've got the technology in there, it's really helping us to, I guess, number one, have a register and record all of the, call it maybe international, local, regulatory, legislative requirements that could be impacting the business. And maybe it's even company policies as well, your own standards, if you like. So we need to identify which are the elements that could have an impact to us. I guess the next one would be to looking at maintaining and sustaining compliance to those particular standards. And how do we go about ensuring that we're maintaining those standards and ensuring those compliance? Is it done through internal audits? Is it done through self-audits? Is it done by external parties? what are the mechanisms and the call it audit instruments that we need to execute to have evidential data to say that we are maintaining that standard and that we are compliant. I guess the other area that I guess technology and maybe even software more specifically in this regard can help is identifying the risks associated with non-conformance. So if we are in potential breach of legislative regulatory standard, then what is the potential consequences to the business? Is it financial? Is it social? Is it brand? Is it environmental consequences? And being able to understand and determine from there what are maybe controls that the business can implement to reduce, I guess, the likelihood of that occurrence, but also try to mitigate and reduce its effect should there be a non-conformance on that regard. And then finally, the software or technology from that perspective can also support from an action perspective as well, right? So as you can imagine, as we're trying to maintain those compliances, audits, checks, maybe reviewing the frequency of the legislation, are there any updates? Do we need to adhere to changing legislation and those types of things? It requires effort from people. So what are the processes, the maybe internal but also external business processes that companies need to follow, action plans that they need to execute in order to maintain and sustain those compliances and those standards, right? So I think software and technology, but software more specifically from my background, plays a really key role because then it just becomes a single repository of information, single source of truth, with authenticated data that sits behind that, right?
Yeah, no, that's right. It's good you mentioned, I guess, the change, because as I said before, there's lots of components that do change within a supply chain, be that regulation, environment, suppliers. So I've been out having a tool that enables you to stay on top of that or understand that, and also the implications it has to your supply chains. Quite a good thing that we need to bring in. And you sort of mentioned technologies such as software that can help monitor compliance and reducing risks in the supply chain. What do you think some of the other tangible benefits, or let's say non-financial benefits, there could be for companies that sort of prioritise health and safety, environment, sustainability and governance in the supply chains, and really looking at sort of beyond compliance and from the risk reduction perspective?
Yeah, good question. And I guess you used a phrase there that I am somewhat a little bit passionate about as well, right? Which is going beyond compliance, because I think sometimes it's often forgotten, right? I think sometimes we get just so focused on just meeting the minimum spec, the minimum viable product, if you like, right? And we don't realize the tangible benefits that can come from just going beyond, compliance. Sometimes just achieving compliance, we don't understand as to what the benefits are just from maintaining compliance as well, right? But sometimes going beyond compliance, there's a bunch of additional business benefits, and that could be from, just enhanced business reputation, stronger brand reputation. It strengthens customer trust, customer brand loyalty, repeat business. Just minimum standard of meeting compliance, access to market, right? So we've got the, I guess, right to do business, if you like, but, maybe going beyond compliance, is there additional markets that we can start gaining access into? We're starting to see and hear things around green premiums, for example. Going beyond compliance, does that mean now I have access to some markets that I previously didn't have access to? Things like operational efficiency as well. I guess having that, a sustainable supply chain not only supports your streamlined supply chain in itself, but it also supports with having predictable supply chains, maybe reducing resource consumptions. It helps with your scope 3 sides of things. reduces your dependence on natural resources as well. So there's obviously operational efficiencies and benefits that can, I guess, result from that as well. Building in long-term resiliency as well. So having that strong governance around maintaining your compliance, but also understanding your supplier's supplier, as you touched on earlier, builds in that resiliency within your supply chain to ensure that, based on my customer demands and me being able to, support those demands in the market, I've got, reliability, predictability, and resiliency in my supply chain. So there's not going to be disruptions and so forth from that. And then, maybe just another one that's sometimes forgotten is just simply employee retention and attraction, right? So if we're working for a company that sometimes is going beyond compliance, we feel good about it, right? We're in a role that is a little bit more fulfilling, and we can see the benefits of the good that we're actually doing, right? So
absolutely,
that's going to attract different types of talent. It's going to attract people that want to come to work and that are wanting to, put in that extra mile. So, I think there's a number of, I guess, benefits that is just sometimes elusive and we don't typically think of when we're just striving for compliance, right? So.
Yeah, totally agree. And it's good to have a look at those other, I guess, opportunities for growth when you're not just looking from a financial perspective. So it's good to bring them out. And I think the employee retention and attraction is a key one as well, because whether it's a generational thing, I'm not sure, but people are caring more about where they work and what that brand stands for, even from where they work, but also what they consume as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm just looking at the time here, so I think we're pretty close to time. So look, Esa, I wanted to thank you for your time today and your insights from today's session. Thank you to all of our listeners. And if you have any questions and would like to follow up and engage with us, please feel free to reach out to us, jump on through our social media platforms, whether it be LinkedIn, visit our website, feel free to reach out, send us an email, and we look forward to seeing you on our next session.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Chris.